Good morning, digital wildcatters. Welcome to 2023. Happy New Year. Joined today, Kurt Coburn,
Good to be
Mark
here.
Meyer.
Happy New Year.
Colin, of course, is out with his recurring prostate problems, but
Let's
who
not
are we
talk
to
about
judge?
that, but it's true.
We shall not judge. I figured what we'd do today on BDE is let's recap 2022, the year that was energy, and it was a crazy freaking year.
Let me first congratulate you, though, on surviving 2022. You were in some crazy places during the holidays, so I'm glad to see you.
I appreciate that. It was a bit of a walkabout, kind of a crazy journey. I think I'll talk more about it on Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. But there was a crazy arc of self-realization, of self-actualization, soul searching, all of that literally started with a glass of champagne in the American Express Lounge in IAH that went through Charlie Robison, Roger Krieger, a Selena hoodie, 3 prescriptions of antibiotics.
Okay.
That culminated in a quote unquote almost that's going on now. So
You
appreciate that.
And
Thank
you also
sir.
look good. Are you been,
Starving myself? Yeah.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Except for the Whataburger.
No, the interesting thing when Pickering gave me shit about getting a single burger, I'm like, I'm counting the calories, Dan. I had 750 calories to get, and I squeaked under it and took the bacon instead of the second patty. So, all right, guys, let's jump into this. 2022, the biggest story, clearly the war. February 21st, Putin launched the invasion, sent the Russians into Ukraine. What have we learned about that? What has it meant? What's the deal?
I think we've learned that these things are a bit more intractable and less black and white in terms of what the players' motivations are. I've not studied a lot about the war lately, but I know there's been a lot of back and forth on our de facto involvement in terms of providing funding and arms and kind of what that means for elevating the geopolitical risk for the United States. So hopefully we've learned that has gotten a little bit past where I think we wanted it to go, right? And so you've had Zelensky over here bolstering his position and also going back with a pretty big check.
Well, and going back with Patriot missiles
Right.
that require United States civilians, operators
Right.
to run it. So
that's a good point. I mean, in reality, we're a lot more involved than what the headlines and kind of the arm's length of this suggest.
I mean, I'm going to go down to Zelensky's running around like he's from Hollywood. I mean, I thought when you're in a war, you're hunkering down on your nation, but he's been traveling around. He's here in the U.S. collecting $110 billion. I'd like to see that money go somewhere else. And I don't even know, like, where's the money going? We think that it went to Sam Friedman, but now he's in jail. So where's that money going? Haven't seen
Is he in
the
jail?
results. Or maybe he's out.
Maybe he's
at his
out.
parents' house.
Yeah, his parents.
He's a $250 million.
He's under
bail,
house arrest.
Right? House arrest. I've had mixed emotions on this. I've gone back and forth on the one. I don't think it's too tinfoil hat to say Hunter Biden, the big guy, getting 10% from Ukrainian interests. All of a sudden, we're sending $110 billion to Ukraine with no audit trail. That to me is not a stretch. That is not crazy. That's at least worthy of asking a question. So I have done that. I've the flip side that I've actually thought through is we've in effect decimated the Russian military for $110 billion. And I go back and forth. Is that good or bad? I mean, is a neutered Putin way more dangerous, or is he in effect safer because he can't do anything now? I mean, he doesn't have the wherewithal to do
But
it.
when we put it in perspective,
But we didn't have the discussion. And
we
didn't
never had the discussion.
That's the thing that bothers me.
Which is what probably the next big story about the ongoing pandemic, which we might get to and should get to. But I think let's look back. Russia, again, is a smaller economy than the state of Texas. So us applauding that we've destroyed a small economy and their military for $110 billion, was it ours to do? I mean, what's the result of this? I think we're all asking questions, but we're being told not to ask questions. And I think that's probably the bigger story.
That I think is. So where does this take us with Russian sanctions, and let's kind of roll that into oil prices? I think early on days, my take was oil's fungible. You're just turning tankers, and so yeah, there's a discount involved if I'm going to buy illegal Russian oil, but so be it. I get a discount. What does that do?
Yeah, good question. Expert, what say you?
I think it continues to impact on the margin, right? It's more event driven than anything else. But I don't think the initial take about the market being pretty fungible, particularly on the oil side, Nord Stream is another matter. But I think it continues to be more political headline grabbing than having any kind of major. They're workarounds, which we've seen, right? You've got, I think the Indian energy minister was at, forget what European conference it was, and said we're going to continue to do what's best for our economy, particularly at a point where we've seen particularly Europe take a lot of spot cargoes of LNG away from non-OECD countries like Pakistan that are struggling with their own power generation and gas supply.
This is a modern war. We've seen. I think Russia's economically doing pretty well. So let's. I think the story is yet to be told here on this whole idea. And I think going back to your tinfoil hat theory, we should watch and start asking questions. We need to be curious and keep watching because I think there's a bigger story here.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, if we're relating this back to oil, you made the point. It's the Russian economy, and they continue to support oil production. To Mark, to your point, are there still workarounds so that production actually satisfies demand in the world? And I think the answer to that's yes, and the like. But I mean, those are potentially the two triggers that could cause some haywire in 2023.
I think the convergence of risk, including this, where you don't have, I guess, the technological support and certainly the maintenance support for the Russian production base. Take that more broadly globally. I think we're running into another year, and we can talk about global capex here in a minute. But I think we're running into another year of subdued or depressed capex, which
great point
elevates the the physical risk that you've talked about. Certainly on the Saudi side, they don't have it. I think you've said it more than a couple of times in 2022. But you're not doing you're not doing the level of maintenance work globally. I think it's more acute in Russia. And so you have to think about the physical supply risk is really showing up when we're also facing, I think, elevated fears of a recession, which is going to have somewhat of a contraction impact on demand. Again, a little bit of a head fake in terms of what's going on.
Did you get
with the underlying supply base?
I did.
I'd love to hear this.
James West from Evercore.
Thank you, James.
Was kind enough to send over his list, and I was going to make a chart out of it. It's an Excel spreadsheet, but kind of the upshot to this.
It's a banker chart.
I should have made the banker.
It's a table. It's a table of numbers.
Looking at it, what you kind of see is what we all sort of know is. You look back and you see worldwide capex spend kind of peaking in 2015. Almost $600 billion, and then it drops down to call it 400 billion and hangs out there in the 400s. And then 2020 COVID, boom, down to 350. 2021 370, and this 2022 we're 3 days out of it, but the estimate's kind of 445, so it did uptick. But Mark and I were talking about this morning how much of that uptick was just flat out inflation. and not real extra
right.
Well,
rigs.
one thing to keep in mind, you're talking about outside of the relatively new wedge that is Permian and Bakken or U.S. unconventional on the oil side. And I forget the exact brackets, but it was, I believe, 2010 through 2015. If you looked at non-U.S., non-OPEC, with the tailwind of the cash flows provided by $90 to $100 oil, non-U.S., non-OPEC was flat in terms of production. So virtually all the growth wedge came from U.S.
It actually-
unconventional.
It actually slightly declined. I mean, you're right to say virtually flat, but
Virtually flat.
technically it has a
Which
a
is
minus in
stunning
front of
given the levels of spending
Right.
that you cited, which tie back to, how much maintenance capex, how much growth capex. There's an increasing amount of maintenance because everything has gotten older. I mean, Gawar was brought on, the largest field in the world was brought on in 1952, right?
Yeah.
And so there's an accelerating capital intensity, both conventional and unconventional, that just given the order of magnitude analysis provided by the spending today versus the spending at the peak, something's got to give from a maintenance standpoint.
So
I don't think it's going to be a dramatic fall off a cliff.
I
We were
wrote
talking
a
about
blog
this.
in maybe 2013 about this capex cliff we're about to run over, and how technology sort of follows and innovation sort of follows this cliff. We're at a cliff. I mean, at $100 oil, everyone's spending money, ad nauseum to keep production. But now that we have no spend, what's going to happen? When are we going to hit the cliff? And if not, what's going to happen? Just sort of slow production increase
what I
regardless
think-
of price.
What I think the bigger deal is all this technology we talked about, like the natural gas boom, the oil boom. We drilled the first horizontal well in the United States in 1937.
Yep.
You know what John Wilkes Booth did before he shot Lincoln?
He fracked.
He fracked. He threw dynamite down. So, I mean, we've technically been fracking forever. It's just, to your point, with higher prices, we had the cash where we could finally perfect those things.
Right.
We went back out to the tool shed. We got the tools that have been sitting there and we used. I don't see anything sitting here, even with $150 oil, that's a tool in the tool shed that we can go get and really see a ramp up like we did from, call it, 2010 to 2019. I mean, we were seeing IPs increase like 40 and 50% a year on average. And when you looked at 18 and 19, they were up like 15% each of those years. And quite frankly, if you took out the Chevron and Exxon wells that they were late to the party drilling in the Permian, if you took those out, the average well actually declined, the IPs. So I think COVID messed that all up. Who knows where that is? But I think if we have a cliff, that is our cliff,
I agree.
So,
Well, there's just a degradation. Reuters had an article this week pointing back to what Scott Sheffield said, I think at CERAWeek back in the spring, about, most companies in the Permian are now drilling largely tier 2 and tier 3. I don't know if that's precisely the case, and part of that's talking your book, but being pretty inventory long. But there is a high grading period that we've gone through here with constrained capital, and I think the projections for what the Permian, for example, are going to do in 22, and then the projections for 23 are undershooting what were the same forecast a year or two ago.
let's do this. Let's kind of make it a mission. Since I'm doing dry January, I'll actually be sober. And let's put some pen to paper and maybe over the next couple of weeks come back and say, hey, here's a projection of what we think supply is going to do, and here's why. Because I will admit, it's always surprise to the upside to me. So, all right, what about the IRA? That was a big fucking deal, man. Where do we start? I mean,
I'm about to explode on this one, but let's hear it.
Go ahead.
The IRA. I mean, Chuck, what say you? I want to hear some original. Come on, let's hear it.
and I'm going to steal from Mark, because Mark brought this up, and I thought this was a really good point, is generally speaking, the way the U.S. government has always worked is we have an objective. We want less of X. We want more of Y, whatever. And they say that, they give tax incentives for it, and they let the market run, right? I mean, that's how we've kind of operated. The IRA really got nitty gritty in terms of it's not that we want less emissions with cars. We want electric vehicles.
That's
And
true.
oh, by the
That's
way,
true.
you get these tax incentives if you manufacture it here, etc. And it got to the point of prescribing outcomes, which we've never done before. Or we've done, but in such a big transformative
Well,
way.
that's the primary objective in a lot of what the political motivations are is ascribing outcomes.
Yeah,
Right.
that's where I was going. I'm trying to hold my tongue, which the IRA is we're starting to head politically in projecting what we want to see when it's not realistic. So the markets and sort of the politics and the markets are fighting each other, and we're seeing this across, especially in energy, is where it's really has started. Is like, do we want a clean environment? Then let's cut off all oil and gas. But do we want to, if you look during the big freeze this year, where was most of our production coming from? How are we heating homes and saving people's lives in Texas? Just looking at ERCOT specifically, it's oil and gas and a little bit of nuclear, a little bit of coal too. But when we look at this across, like the IRA is, I think, a cluster. It's another inflation. I mean, you add that with Ukraine and 110 billion, we just keep spending money. But where's that going? It's not really doing anything. And as an entrepreneur that watches regulation, because that's good opportunity. It's like, where's the opportunity to make a difference? Is where is there support for that a business? And like, I don't know in the IRA where the real support is, because I look at the economics. I'm like, the economics and what the government's trying to spend money on doesn't make sense yet.
So Mark Mills gave me this heads up. You can go to, I believe it's Volvo's website, and they've got a detailed kind of report on carbon emissions from manufacturing process of EVs. I mean, we know what internal combustion engines do, right? We've built a ton of them forever. We know how much on the road. We don't really know that about EVs. Did we discuss, well, what's the trade-off on carbon footprint, given that we're going to go spend trillions of dollars transitioning to this? Volvo did that work. And if you look at kind of the worldwide mix of generating electricity today, and let's say we are going to get better over time, but just where we are today, it's like almost 90,000 miles, I think, which is better. I mean, most cars run more than 90,000 miles, but at the same time, that's a lot of capital to spend for that trade-off. If you look at Europe, which is for the most part the most renewable generation out there, it's still like, I think, 65,000 miles or 70,000 miles. And so, I mean, we just basically prescribe that that's what we're going to do. And we're not going to break over on each car until call it 75,000 miles.
And I mean, from a political standpoint, who cares? If you look at the IRA, that putting this to work, no one really cares that math doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah.
Do they?
And they're purporting solutions. I forget who said famously that there are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Right.
So if we start to dig into the trade-offs with more granularity, you talk about the specific stipulations about what percentage is quote unquote manufactured here in the U.S. We don't do manufacturing; we do assembly.
Right.
Kind of swim upstream
That's a good
to the raw materials, and even things like processed cobalt, most of which comes out of China, and then upstream of that, the raw cobalt, which we've talked a little bit. I know you tweeted about Siddharth Kara's cobalt podcast he did with Joe Rogan. Addressing that part of the value in the supply chain when we're focusing trillions of what ends up being kind of political largesse to the Senate here in the United States. We don't manufacture anything. There's plenty of trade-offs, some of which are unsavory still, that aren't solved by this transition. What are those trade-offs? The other one, and I know Colin's talked a lot about the F-150 Lightning, as for instance, is 35% heavier than its competitor ICE F-150. That has all kinds of negative implications for road maintenance and, more
Road
importantly,
infrastructure,
safety.
et cetera.
Safety.
So let me throw one tinfoil hat thing at you that you're gonna roll your eyes at first, but I've the source is actually good and well researched. Where this is going? Why did we push towards electric vehicles? One, we didn't have the discussion of what kind of gain are we really making. Two, when we talk about, hey, the breakover's like 75,000 miles. Is that really worth the money? It's still. Wellfield Rando actually tweeted out the reason we want to go to electric cars is because that gets rid of the gasoline tax, and we are going to have some system for taxing for road work. Fixing the roads and all. It's going to be tracking in your car because you're going to pay per mile, and the government's going to be able to track where we go because you're going to have a device. You're going to have to pay taxes based on how many miles you drive. And I was kind of pushing back on him because he's a dear friend, and I was like, dude, that's even tinfoil hat for me. He found a provision in, I don't know if it was in the IRA, but it was in legislation within the last 18 months where the government spending $25 million on a test project to track per miles by cars.
Of course.
By embedding sensors.
The insurance companies have been doing this for at least a decade, so it's not necessarily hard to.
The technology is easy to do,
especially with phone tracking. I mean, we're already being tracked, so that's not a hard to find. I think one of the brilliant things, and it's evil in some ways, is that economics has always ruled, especially our generation, right? Economics always sort of wins out at the end of the day, but today it's emotion. And EV, it's been spectacular to watch, and watching this sort of climate space. I called it energy technology. Now I just call it climate tech because that's the the verbiage now. That's the nomenclature. But if you look at some of these policies and trends, it's not based on economics. It's based on emotion. And when emotion gets involved, it becomes religion. And if you're anti-religion, you're out. And so you have to be extremely careful. And that's what's interesting. It's like we're talking tinfoil when this is just, we're observing data that doesn't make any sense. We're going, it's tinfoil because we're afraid to say, this is some scary shit. And it doesn't make any economic sense. And that is sort of against what we've seen and grown up to see in markets. Yes or no?
And it goes back, I think, to your point that you made. We can't have the discussion about it.
We're not allowed to.
We're not allowed to, because I actually don't have a problem with the environmentalist movement if they phrased it as, hey, this is going to be so horrific for mankind and the planet that we have to reduce our standard of living today, at least for a while, as we build these technologies. But guys, that means we can't fly around in private jets. That means we can't do this. We can't do that. I acknowledge that there is a problem with reliability and those type things as we make this transition. And I would be, that's intellectually honest. I would be okay with that. But
the other part is it's being presented as somehow all the big global actors are on the same page in terms of transition. And if you look at what China and India are doing and some other countries with respect to continuing to build out things like coal-fired power generation, which just the increment over the last year or two, I forget the exact stat, has wiped out all the gains that we've made in emissions reduction by switching from coal to natural gas in the U.S. over the last 15 years. Toby Rice talks about that quite a bit on the big grand LNG build out. But the assumption that there's the bad actors who are not in the boat will say they're in the boat, really want us to continue to push down this path.
There is no peeing and non-peeing section of the pool.
That's right.
You piss in the pool, you piss in the pool.
That's, they know the discourse is increasingly, at least in the West, and particularly in the United States, the discourse is more and more driven by emotion. I think it's a great point. We can't even raise basic facts of thermodynamics and physics when we talk about some of this stuff for fear of being
canceled
or labeled a tinfoil hat.
And And it's
conspiracy
proof,
nut job.
it's proof positive on the economics that solar, wind are not competitive with coal by the virtue of the fact that two authoritarian governments, India and China, are choosing to build way more coal than they are solar and
Absolutely.
wind,
China's filled with coal. It's
Yeah.
cheap and abundant energy. And
Yeah.
what economy thrives is the leading economies of the world thrive when there's cheap and abundant energy.
Yeah.
So let's just stay right there.
Yeah.
And when there's no tax for, sort of the cost of, which whether I'm not necessarily advocating for or against, but if coal has no real tax against it, because the environmental impact is not shared, if there is one, and how to measure it, then I mean, the Chinese are getting away scot-free. And as a business person, wouldn't you do the same?
Yeah.
You want an advantage. And if you
Yeah.
could use a cheaper source of inputs
Yeah.
and sell the same outputs for the same price, or maybe even cheaper, you're going to win.
Yeah. All right, let's do this. Kind of rapid fire, but not hugely rapid fire because we're all kind of old.
We're old,
as
and
rapidly
we're
as we
starving,
can.
and we're dry. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
pissed.
Yeah, exactly.
We're
right
hangry
there.
and pissed.
Let me hit on 4 or 5 other big stories that happened this year.
Let's hit it.
A take or two. All right. Twitter Musk takeover. What does that mean to energy?
What does it mean for energy? Not much. I don't think it matters a lot for energy. However, our buddies and those that we follow are not going to be canceled, we think. So good news is I think we're having a better debate, and we get to see people that are actually telling truth about oil and gas are going to be still on a social media platform. I like that, but I don't think it's going to have a big impact. That's my take.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, we have seen some more recent suspensions that have crossed over into areas that at least appear to be counter to what Musk believes individually, which I think Rando got canceled or suspended for something fairly benign recently and then
Right.
got back on. But
relative to Rando.
Well,
But anyway,
we-
God love you.
we also have to remember that how much of the universe is actually on Twitter. And
Very
then,
little.
then the subset of that is energy, not much.
That actually was a great point that was made last night during the football game. I'm blanking on the name of the player. Damar got hurt, was sitting there. I saw an interview with somebody that said, 5% of the world jumps on Twitter and blames somebody, and that's what they do. The Damar's charity raised $3 million since last night because he does Toys for Tots, basically.
It's a great story.
In his hometown where he went to college. And 95% of Americans, when something goes bad, are good people, and they try to do something. Not that is going to save Damar's life by giving to Toys for Tots, but they try to do a good action to make something better.
Right.
And so I think that was something that I knew, but I didn't fully appreciate. But it was really nailed home very well last night.
I mean, it's nice to see. A country always falls from within. It never is attacked. And when you're weak internally is when you are easy to attack. When 9/11 happened, we saw a rally of nationalism, of people rallying. I think we saw that last night. It was nice to see. Now, there were a lot of people that were asking very good questions, but which goes back to our sort of cancel culture. You're not allowed to ask some of the obvious questions that we saw with that event. But it was nice to see the rallying, and I saw it a lot on Twitter, which is, it's a town, it's a town gathering spot.
I mean, there were things going on with the more recent convulsions in China pushing back on the extreme lockdowns, videos of which you couldn't find anywhere else but Twitter.
Yeah,
this is true. Good point.
No, that's a really good point.
Colin's talked about that before. And I do find, like in energy news, and I always use the example of Pioneer and Parsley way back when it happened, late on a Friday, and going into a weekend, you wanted to know more. The denizens of Twitter were actually putting out very useful facts and figures around that deal that you didn't have to wait for, most of the brokers put out their notes on Monday.
And the cool part of Twitter just is that sometimes if in your feed someone likes something and it hits your feed, you get to see the people. Like my wife saw something that I tweeted about that guy on the oil field in the middle of the night when it was way below zero. His hard hat was frozen over with ice, and he's keeping the lights on. I'm like, and it just sticks with you that, wow, there are people on the wall protecting us from freezing to death, and they're working in an environment where, man, they're just like 5 minutes from freezing to death or dying themselves to help us. You don't see that anywhere else because you're not going to go looking for that.
Yeah, that's true. So, all right, Twitter Musk. Let's shift to Europe. Energy crisis, Nord Stream. Any take in there?
You know, I follow Europe all the time because I think I really like watching sort of what happens in Europe. I think Europe, their energy crisis is big because of policy decisions by individual countries. Like Germany is such a great story about making really stupid decisions about trying to get rid of cheap energy for the environment and then getting screwed because energy costs are just too high and they have to import Russian oil or they can't. Renewables are just not cutting it. So Europe is sort of unfortunately too woke. They're not making great economic decisions. Enter Russia and Ukraine, which just makes it even more interesting. Let's hand it over now with that background, Nord Stream.
Yeah, I mean, Nord Stream is the kind of acute element of all this, and I think Germany is really the
Center.
The poster
The
child of
strongest
all of
economy
this.
that's already
I read
been sort of
somewhere,
in the post
I think
for
it was
Europe.
Doomberg pointed out in a piece that, you know, Germany effectively spent $500 billion on a scramble for emergency coal and LNG supplies to get through and prepare for and stockpile.
They have a ton of lignite.
What could you do with that capital, so to speak, to build out things like nuclear, which enter the conversation on both sides now? You know, this warm weather that we're seeing here for an extended period is certainly helping dodge the bullet. But do we want to go into every winter? And I'll sidebar this a little bit because you have two of the leading voices out there, Fatih Birol with the IEA and Secretary General Guterres, every chance they get, talk about needing to accelerate the transition with nothing but a focus on kind of the nouveau renewables and wind and solar, for example, with no conversation really about, you know, the criticality of building base generation, LNG, and nuclear. And so, you know, I think there's a collision potentially if we run into a situation where we're not betting on black in the weather casino every year and coming up black. It might come up red.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the way to look at Europe is they got really freaking lucky with warm weather. You know, I mean, they really did. And if they don't take it as we got lucky, then it's only going to be worse next winter.
Right.
So, all right. One other thing we need to throw out there. So we had Winter Storm Uri, and back February 21, mess, shit show. We passed Senate Bill 3 of 2021, basically they call it the Winterization Act, if you will. Railroad Commission implemented it this summer. I am going to go on record because I did a podcast.
Mark this down.
I'm going to go on record. I did a podcast where a big water flood operator came on, the guys from BESA, and basically said, hey, they're deeming us critical because they want our 52 MCF of gas a day, but our load's 30 megawatts. And so we're not going to be able to participate in the load shedding program when the shit hits the fan. So Don't think you made this any better. I ranted about the Railroad Commission during that. I will give them credit. The Railroad Commission actually took that under advisement, sorted through it. They were the original plan was going to be, well, we'll have a hearing, we'll sort it out. And I was like, well, who's going to spend $1 million to go through a hearing? I'm just going to let you deem me critical. But anyway, I think they got it right. We had problems with ERCOT this summer. If we didn't have a rainstorm in central Texas on one day, we would have had blackouts. But we actually went through our recent freeze okay. So Mixed bag on that, but slightly to the positive.
Well, before
Well-
we talk about this, I just want to mark something. BlackRock listens to BDE and makes decisions. Now we have another data point that the Railroad Commission listens to BDE and follows our advice. Chuck, kudos to you.
No, I had Nathan Magoo, who came on and was so gracious to talk that through. I actually think that podcast wound up bouncing around to relevant people and made a difference. I actually do. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I think, and this is amateur meteorologist or weather observer, I think one of the big natural differences between Uri and what we just went through over the Christmas holidays is that this was a much drier event. We didn't have a whole bunch of precipitation,
True.
snow and ice.
And shorter.
Right. But, relatively speaking, I think we observed up in South Dallas, otherwise known as the Woodlands, a low of
You said South Dallas, immediately thought
a low of 14
So
or
thanks,
a low
sir.
of 14 or 15. And it was surprisingly persistent, but what you did notice was that you weren't having to go out and tent your pool equipment with, your tailgating tents that ultimately collapsed because they got too much snow on them. But it was a relatively dry event, and that
point.
moisture causes a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Otherwise.
Good point. We'll still let you off the hook a little bit, Railroad Commission. All right, let's do this. Predictions. I'm going to ask you for what's oil price at the end of 2023, and then number 2, give me a prediction. So
If
Yeah,
you go to oil prices, you can't be in the middle. You got to be extreme to be effective and win. I'm going to say it's $37 at the end of.
37.
I'm going to 37.
And
I
what
could've gone
drives-
high.
What drives that? What's your rationale?
Well, first it goes to vacation, and it's a good movie quote. But I think I'm going to see that. I think the people are going to rebel. I think there's going to be a massive. Well, this goes to my big prediction. I think that there's going to be another huge COVID event in this year.
Okay.
I believe that.
So
but
it's going to be. It's basically going to be demand driven.
I think the economy is going to suck this year. I
Okay.
think we're seeing like startups had a really hard year last year raising money. Funding's down. There's a ton of dry powder, but I think startups had a hard time. They're going to have an even harder time this year. Stocks didn't do well last year. I think we're headed straight into a long recession, which is to keep oil prices suppressed. And I think we're going to see more supply online unless there's another war, which barring, I go high or low, I'm going $37, and that's my take, and I'm sticking to it.
So that's oil price prediction too.
It's
That-
massive
that was
outbreak.
37.
Okay.
Does
Massive
that have
outbreak.
does that have a plus sign in front of it?
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah.
Didn't we
Yeah.
hit minus 37? Wasn't that the
minus 37?
I'm doing a plus, and I was thinking about golf handicaps. Like that would be pretty interesting. But
Nice.
yeah, no, 37.
All right, Mark.
I'm going to go to, we continue to muddle through this tedium, both on the demand side, but I think first prediction is the Astros repeat, which hasn't been done since the
Wow.
Yankees did it in 2000. And that was the end of a three-peat.
Are you going to buy a bunch of gallery furniture?
Yeah.
I did that last year.
Okay. All right.
And I was in
That's how you show your.
I was in the 2X payoff
Ooh,
category. So
nice.
Bam.
anyway, I think energy remains the place to be and the place to go for equities. I don't think you have a lot of, certainly high growth valuation case to move elsewhere. I think fixed income and bonds are problematic for a lot of the reasons you outline.
Mhm.
I think because I spent a portion of my Wall Street career working for Matt Simmons and Jerry Castellini, I think I've got to be a bit more of a constructive bull, or maybe a perma bull, as they were often called. I think we muddle around and end up pretty much right about where we are in the high 80s to low 90s. And I'll put a
Loser.
92.9 KSRR. I think was the call sign for a good rock station in Houston that's no more. And the prediction would be that for another consecutive year that energy equities broadly outperform the market in tech. Dan Rice III, who was a legendary CIO PM in Boston for a number of years. I remember in my early analyst days, I predicted in 2000 that energy was going to outperform again in 2001. And he said, never make that prediction because it never comes true.
Let me ask you a question to
And
drill
it
down
didn't.
on this. Walt Disney stock versus ExxonMobil. Boom. At the end of the year, at the end of this year, who's going to perform better?
I think Exxon continues to perform better.
All right.
Yes.
You've got
Making it real.
Once again,
Trying to make it real.
you've got cash flows in the 3 to 4 times. Oh, and anyway, that's
once again, you two are wrong. Oil ends the year at
God,
112.96.
that's hot right there. You're going big.
I'm going big, but the equities actually decouple. So energy equities are relatively flat during the year. It's the commodities year to run. So I would be on the NYMEX, not in the stocks to play on this. This is going to be driven by an unexpected supply shock to the downside, because I think the chickens are finally coming home to roost on the CapEx issue. But like we said, we're going to do some math on that and see if that holds out. The prediction for the year, and I hope this does not happen, so don't take this as I'm rooting for it. Russia, Putin, in a debilitated state, uses a nuclear weapon in the Ukraine war. And I hope that does not happen, but that is my prediction. I don't know that we have the world leader anywhere to deal with that. And that's what I'm very frightened of. If that happens, then all bets are off on oil prices. You could be right. I could be right.
I was going to point out the irony of a guy entering dry January wearing a Shotgun Willie t-shirt.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to call it a nice quarter guy's Twitter handle, because his reply yesterday, I was like, this guy, I hope he's right. I mean, I don't hope he's right, but I love his prediction. 2 facts: Freeport will never export another molecule. So as a surfer that hangs out and surfs Quintana, that's interesting. Secondly, it'll be 7 degrees in every major population center for the next 3 months. So I hope nice quarter guys we're following and watching him to see if that's true or not.
All right, let's do it. We have Mark Meyer's very own finger of the week.
Switch off, by the way.
All right, Mark, lay it on us.
In other sobering and very serious news, Rolling Stone came out earlier this week or last week with its top 200 singers of all time. Notably absent from the list, and this is really about the list, so the finger goes to the list, is, and I'm not a fan, but
you have to say that.
How do you leave Celine Dion off the list? How does Taylor Swift rank ahead of Roger Daltrey? How is Freddie Mercury not in the top 5? Oh, and there's other notable snubs. Pat Benatar, none of the Bee Gees.
This is going to Twitter.
So what was the criteria for greatest singer? Just pure vocal ability? What was
No, it's not purely vocal talent. Otherwise, you probably don't have Bob Dylan at 15. Yeah. It's the whole kind of, when you first hear it, is it that transcendent, you know who it is.
Right?
There is no fine print. Rolling Stone top 200. You don't even have to ask. We just know. That's why it's finger of the week, is because Celine Dion's not even there.
All right. So I like that. Who was number 1?
Aretha.
Okay.
Whitney Houston number 2.
Okay, I can live with that.
Okay. I'm not sure I'd put them 1, 2, but we're gonna settle this on Twitter, I think.
I know.
Probably.
I know that Chuck Yates was not on that list. So,
who would Chuck Yates number 1 be?
Where I have that discussion is actually greatest lead singer, and that takes in stage presence, all that sort of stuff. And I've always said it's Mick or it's Freddie. I mean, as much as I love David Lee Roth, it's
I knew that.
It's
I for some reason just heard you before you even said David Lee Roth, because that bounced in my head, and then you said it.
We came here to
What's going
entertain
on,
you.
man?
Leaving here, we aggravate you. Don't you know?
Sammy's
it means
better.
The same to us.
Sammy is better
Vocally.
for Van Halen.
I'd
but
rather go get a beer with Sammy, but he's not a better vocalist. I mean, in
Read,
terms of all that.
read Ted Templeman's book
I
about the whole discovery and production of Van Halen. Very early on, there was a thought, an inclination that he had to actually replace in the 70s DLR with Sammy Hagar.
Where
Yeah,
was
that-
Chris Cornell on that list? Because Soundgarden's frontman was a genius vocalist.
Not there, not that I saw.
Okay, that's why I give them a finger.
Nora Jones wasn't there. Nat King Cole wasn't there. You know, like I said, Pat Benatar wasn't there.
I'm totally down with giving Rolling Stone it every week. They've lost so much. Digital Wildcatters, thank you for joining us on BDE. We will be back next week. Hopefully, Colin will repair his prostate in the following week. If you like the podcast, please comment, please download it, share it with friends.